Thank you for joining us for the Research and Creative Works live presentations. We're going to continue with institutional barriers to youth and voter turnout with Emily.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Emily Gilby and I'm a senior majoring in political science here at Southwestern, and I am going to be presenting my honors thesis on institutional barriers to youth voter turnout. Is it full screened? Everybody can see it okay? Just before I start. Okay, perfect. Oh, 1 second. Okay, so there's this narrative in American politics that states that young people generally do not turn out to vote. And while there's some truth in that statement and that youth voter participation has declined since the voting age was lowered to 18, youth voter patterns actually mimic those of older age groups, meaning that when turnout in general is higher than average, the percentage of young people who turn out in that same election is also higher than average. However, young people still turn out at a much lower rate than older voters. So this brought me to my research question, which is, are young voters really all that different from other voters? So some of the more recent literature on youth voting pushes against the notion that low youth voter turnout is a result of political apathy. And it suggests that young people are in fact engaging in politics. We're just engaging in ways other than voting. So we're talking about politics on social media and we're protesting. It's just not translating to the polling booth. And the existing literature also suggests that people of all ages are more likely to participate in politics when the perceived benefits of engaging outweigh the costs. So there's also this cost-benefit analysis that goes into the process of deciding whether to vote or sit out an election for young people. And then another major theme from the literature is that institutional barriers to voting that are implemented at all levels of government negatively impact turnout in general, so for people of all ages, but they have a particularly negative effect on young voters. And this is because some scholars believe this is because young voters or young people in general don't have the same non-cognitive skills as older people and thus older voters. So Holbein and Hilliga specifically talk about things like grit and perseverance that they say are important to navigating barriers to voting. And then to research this topic, I conducted in-depth interviews with 21 young people in November and December of 2020. So within weeks of the presidential election, and participants were between the ages of 18 and 29. So my youngest participant was 18 and the oldest was 29. And this is the generally accepted age range for the youth cohort. Sometimes you'll see 18 to 24, but I don't think 25 is that old. So I went with 18 to 29. And the majority of participants were current college students in the state of Texas. Each participant was asked about their experiences with the voter registration process and the process of actually casting their ballot, as well as how they view these processes in terms of accessibility, not just for young people, but also more broadly. And then I also asked each person how often they voted, how they learned to cast their ballot, how they knew where to go vote, and questions like that in order to discern where their knowledge of these processes came from, and also just to learn more about their individual voting behaviors. And so I grouped my findings by hypothesis. So my first hypothesis states that the higher the initial cost of voting, the less likely a young person will turn out to vote. And from the interviews, I found that those who did not vote in either the 2020 presidential primary nor the 2020 general presidential election did not turn out because of certain institutional barriers they encountered, but also because of a sense of apathy towards these specific elections. So not apathy towards the entire political system, but just these two specific elections. And so, and just so you know, all the names are changed. So these aren't the real names of the participants. But an example is Lauren, who cares about politics, and she voted in the 2018 midterm election. She did not participate in either 2020 race because she ran into problems when applying for an absentee ballot. And as soon as she hit that barrier, she decided to opt out of the election because for her, the costs associated with mailing in an application, waiting to receive the application, or the actual ballot, and then filling out the ballot, mailing the ballot, et cetera, those costs outweighed the perceived benefits of participating in that election for her. So she says it was more the mail-in process than anything. That was the reason she didn't vote. But there's also the mentality of it wasn't really worth it, so it's not something for her to regret. And what I also found to be interesting as well was that there is variation among those who did vote. So several of the participants only voted at the national or state level, but not the local level, in races such as school board or city council. And for them, it wasn't necessarily institutional barriers. It was more of a lack of information acting as a barrier, as well as just the logistics of these elections. Municipal elections, they're usually on a Saturday in May, like election day is May 1st. This year, we have an election going on right now across Texas. And, they're not on a Tuesday in November, I think, is a problem because people, when they think of election day, they think of Tuesday, November. And they're also just not as publicized as national and even some state races are. And so this information barrier led participants to express that they felt they weren't knowledgeable about local politics, and so they shouldn't even have a say in local politics. So Nora talks a bit about this. She says, I don't know if my voice is honestly beneficial. And she was talking about a school board election in this case, because I'm not the one who knows what the school board needs in that sense. And it's not that she doesn't care, it's just she doesn't really have time to learn about it as well. And then my second hypothesis states that the more obstacles there are to voting, the more political motivation is required to exercise the right to vote. And so the information I gathered from the interviews largely supports this statement, since I found that participants who had a clear sense of political motivation, why am I voting, were more likely to overcome barriers to voting and actually cast their ballots. So one participant tried to vote in the presidential primaries on campus, and they ran into trouble because they were still registered in their home county, which was not the same county as the county in which their campus was situated. But because they had such a clear sense of political motivation, which for them, part of it was they viewed voting as a civic duty, but also it was combined with a sense of urgency around getting the current president at that time voted out of office. So this political sense of motivation led them to seek help and try to find other ways to cast their ballot. And so they were able to cast a limited ballot and still vote in state and national races in the county on their campus, even despite this registration barrier. Motivation, however, is not the cure-all to voting problems simply due to the logistics of certain elections. So like Alexis, who was able to cast a limited ballot, Avery also viewed voting as an important act and felt like it was her civic duty, but this motivation was not enough to help her overcome the same exact registration barrier that Alexis faced. Just because Avery voted on election day itself and not during the early voting period, and you can only cast a limited ballot during early voting. And so motivation is not the cure-all. And then for my third hypothesis, it states that young people who are able to overcome barriers to voting have been exposed to voter education resources. And the experiences of the 21 people I interviewed also support this, as most of the people who participated in an election had been exposed to some type of voter education resource, whether it was a family member, an event at their school, or something that they found on social media. And something I found to be really interesting, in my opinion, was that those who were involved in civic engagement or voting organizations, that involvement itself acted as a voter education resource. So Gabrielle states that she learned the importance of voting in local elections and just voting in general by becoming involved in student groups on campus and in her community. But what's also really interesting is that for that same exact participant, a lack of exposure before she became involved played a significant role in her lack of participation between the ages of 18 and 21. And it's because in Texas, we have strict voter ID laws, and you have to show a photo ID to vote. And usually people use their driver's license. And so Gabrielle, she knew about the voter ID laws, and she thought that it meant that she had to have a driver's license in order to register to vote and vote. And she didn't have her license until she was 21. And so she didn't register until she was 21, even though she was eligible at the age of 18. And again, this is before she became involved on campus. And so, possibly if she had been exposed to some sort of voter education resource, especially one about voter ID laws, she might have participated earlier, 3 years earlier. So that was really interesting. And so without the proper resources to help guide certain people through the registration and voter processes, some young people are unable to overcome these barriers. And then for implications, so this research indicates certain points of intervention within the registration and voting processes. Where can state legislatures, civic engagement groups, and individuals themselves intervene within these processes to help young people overcome barriers to voting? And I won't get super into this right now, but you could ask questions about it later. But for example, one point of intervention could be the registration process, which was a big barrier for the people I interviewed. And so colleges could potentially integrate voter reg efforts into student orientation programming. And then also, like I talked about with Avery and Alexis, the process of re-registering or updating your address is a barrier. And so this could be overcome by instituting same-day voter reg, because if we had same-day voter reg, that barrier of, I'm registered back in my home county, which is hours away, that wouldn't even be a barrier. So that kind of gives insight into certain kinds of policies that would be effective at increasing youth voter turnout. And then also just overall understanding the factors that go into a young person's decision whether to vote can help us figure out how to increase youth voter turnout in general. And real quick, I just want to thank everybody for listening. And I want to thank my honors advisor, Dr. Emily Sidner, for guiding me through this whole process over a year and a half, and for making me a better student, researcher, and writer. And I want to thank my family for supporting me. And that is my presentation. Do I need to stop sharing?
Yeah, if that's okay with you. And then
Yeah, that's perfect.
want to go ahead and open it up if there are any questions or comments for Emily.
Emily, I'd love to ask a question. Where are you? There you are. I love the richness of the qualitative feedback, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the level that you feel like you can generalize from 21 qualitative interviews. Can you generalize for a specific set of youth, or sort of what are the limitations and also the ability to generalize based on your sample?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's something that we certainly thought about. The experiences of 21 young people between the ages of 18 to 29, it doesn't account for the experiences of all the youth in the US. But I think it's important and it's insightful just to listen to what these people are experiencing. You can look at the data and the numbers, but I think just sitting down with people and listening to them is really helpful. And it kind of also gives an insight into Texas college students in particular. Not everybody who I interviewed was a college student. Most of them were in Texas, one was in Virginia, but also, people who are engaged and who aren't engaged. So we had some non-voters, and then some people who were, work in politics and also work in these different civic engagement groups on campus. But it was interesting that despite their level of engagement in politics, in different ways other than voting, they had very similar experiences. And even people who didn't necessarily experience barriers themselves, they acknowledged barriers that were out there. They talked about, like my friend experienced this. So I agree with you, it's limited, but I think it's still important in itself just to actually go to young people and, say like, what's your experience with this process? If that does that answer your question? Okay.
Hi, Emily. This is Joan Parks. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes. I was wondering about how universities might engage in online voting systems that, and I just listened to someone in computer science here, so it was beyond me. But how would universities and colleges, and have you thought about this, the online voting systems and how somehow it could be hosted on a university website? I don't know the parts and pieces to that, but it just seems like something that we're going toward anyway, more online voting, and how the university could be part of that, where that piece could fit in for college students.
I don't know about online voting, like actually casting your ballot online. Is that what you mean? Or like voter education resources online?
Well, both. I mean, it seems like, it seems like it would provide a kind of a process that students would have access to on college campus, but it would have to be, I think there would be many parts of this that would have to happen for it to happen, but it just seems like something at the university level could, in electronic mode, perhaps help with the issues of online voting.
Yeah, I think something that schools can do, and Southwestern did this through community engaged learning and SU Votes. We had an SU Votes kind of website with different voter education resources. That was really helpful, especially during COVID, because we couldn't hold events or table or anything like that. And so we had different things about like, the deadlines and how to register, how to like apply for a mail-in ballot, things like that. It could have been publicized more, but it was just difficult. I think we did a good job though. But as to online voting, I don't think we're going to have the ability to vote online anytime soon, especially in Texas, just because of, especially like with the tone that the state legislature has set for voting this session. There are a lot of different voter suppression bills that are happening, or that are in the state legislature right now. So I don't know what the college could do at that level, but I think that different universities can really work harder to promote voter engagement. And at the online level, just providing resources, I think would be a good idea.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have time for maybe one more question or comment.
I have a question, if that's okay. Hi, Emily, it's Eugenia. I was just wondering if you could maybe speak to what factors affect political motivation. I know you said that wasn't always something that was able to overcome institutional barriers, but I wondered if you found that political motivation to cast a ballot varied across race or gender or anything like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I didn't necessarily talk about that in my paper. That's really interesting, the race and gender, how it varies. I did see some of that. Some people talked about certain policies that impacted them, like women's rights and immigration, that made them more politically motivated. And so that's really interesting. I think that'd be something really interesting to look into and further research. Yeah, I don't want to go over time. I'm sorry. I see that Alicia's now the host, but we can talk about this later, Eugenia. That's okay.
Thank you.
Great questions for a great presentation. Let's give a virtual round of applause to Emily,